Mr. John Whitehead, who's a well-known member of the Foreign Policy Association, gave what I consider one of my all-time favorite introductions at a luncheon for Dr. Kissinger. And John said, he said, well, Mr. Kissinger, of course, needs no introduction, but he loves it so. I do want to say I've been doing a series of events, but this one is almost like coming home. The Foreign Policy Association has been a supporter, an inspirer of this book over the 4 years that I've been writing it. 4 years, that's a long time, isn't it? 4 years I've been writing it. And members from the board, Noel Lateef, the president, the staff, they've just been outstanding help throughout this whole process. And I know many of you are members of the Foreign Policy Association, but it is, to me, the quintessential, nonpartisan, almost 100-year-old organization that tries to get Americans, everyone interested in foreign policy. And if you don't belong to the Foreign Policy Association, then you should. So I did want to thank the FPA for all the support that this book got from you. What I'm going to try and do is talk a little bit about what the book is, some of the main arguments in the book. I'm then going to talk about, for a few moments, how it came to be written. And then hopefully I've opened enough windows to where you'll then get into a Q&A and ask those questions for which I've been preparing for a month now. The book is about the state and the future of the transatlantic alliance, and I use that phrase broadly to mean the American relationship with the European Union. It is my contention in the book that this relationship is in intensive care, that just a change in personalities and multilateral attitudes is not going to fix it, that what is needed is a renegotiation of the relationship, sitting across the table with the European Union as equals, and laying out the ground rules for a new relationship that will last the next 50 years. The point that I try to make in the book is that the rift between the erstwhile allies is due to a number of causes that were kept under control, if you will, by the mutual threat of nuclear destruction with the Soviet Union. The Cold War kept the lid on a lot of the differences, and with the Cold War now not there anymore, they began to surface, and during the lead up to the Iraqi war have surfaced with a rupture that will not be easy to fix. I maintain that the relationship is as vital as ever, that it is necessary, that in fact it is more necessary now than it ever was. And the point I make is, and Mr. Bush Sr., one of the 10 leaders I talked to, spoke to this. He said, you know, the European Union is fast emerging as a economic and political power bloc. And is this the right time to disengage? It behooves us to engage with the European Union at this point and make sure that when they do emerge as a new entity, that it is more in partnership with us rather than in competition. So that's a reason that I put forward for the importance of the relationship. The second one has to do with the profound beliefs that are built into the DNA, if you will, of both sides. You look around the world, there are Europe and America are two or very few places where there is an understanding of who the individual is, an understanding of how an individual fits into society. Liberal democracy, freedom are built into the structure of both sides. And looking at the extremism, looking at the various forms of troubles that are around the world today, I maintain that the Allies together will be better able to build the structures that are necessary. Senator Hagel, another one of the interlocutors in my book, maintains that in the 50s, President Eisenhower laid out a basic framework together with a number of far-sighted people that led to the institutions that we now know, the United Nations, GATT, all of those institutions that held the world together for the last 50 years. But we now need, we are in a new paradigm, we need a new set of frames to carry us through the next 50 years. And these have to do with issues like poverty, they have to do with issues like illiteracy and disease, pandemics, the differences between the developing world. He maintains that when one loses human dignity, one loses everything. Brent Scowcroft, another one of the interlocutors I talked to, says you have only to look at the state of affairs all the way from Mediterranean up to China, the lack of education, the poverty, and these are the issues that we now need to deal with. And I maintain in my book that that the alliance will be able to do this better than any other structure of its kind. The third reason that I point to is the business relationship. Most people don't realize the enormous business relationship that ties the European Union and the United States together. This is I'm sure some of you may know, almost a $3 trillion relationship. 8 million Europeans and Americans work for each other's firms, just as many Americans work for European firms as Europeans work for American firms. Did I say that right? Americans work for European firms, equal number, the opposite around. Some statistics are valuable. There is more European Union investment in Texas alone than there is all of American investment in Japan and China combined. Worth thinking about. There are more, the headlines talk about China, talk about India, manufacturing jobs. American affiliates in Germany employ more workers in manufacturing by almost 90% than all American affiliates in China. Netherlands, more bottom line out of American affiliates than companies in China. This is a huge relationship, and should anything ever happen to it, it would cause a great deal of trouble. I wanted to bring this home a little bit. New York, the investment from the European Union is spread throughout the country. $39 billion is invested in New York. This accounts for 337,000 jobs. In my now home state of Vermont, $1 billion is invested from the European Union. There's 7,000 jobs that are counted for that. Half of these jobs are manufacturing jobs. These are the jobs that are slinking away, so it's very important that these jobs are 80% of the produce from Vermont from these manufacturing jobs is exported. So this relationship is huge. Now, it is so huge that I maintain that because of it, the rift is not as severe as it would have otherwise been. But it's not a given that it will always be that way. I would draw your attention back to 2003, where actually 2003, where steel tariffs, you may recall, were imposed on European products. And remember, the Europeans then selected a number of areas that would be of the greatest the political that would create the most political damage for a president then running, and gave the United States 30 days to dismantle those tariffs. And that's exactly what happened. Two other examples which are in a slightly lighter tone. A month before the Iraqi war, Saddam Hussein had decided that that oil, remember the oil for food program, that the oil in that program could only be purchased in euros. One of the first tenders that was put out after he was overthrown was for oil. And all of that was immediately changed, and the tenders reverted back to the dollar. You might know that all oil is denominated in dollars. There are roughly $600 billion that are held as a reserve currency in the Middle East, and should some of that start going into the euro, there would be a lot of consternation. Now, here's a conspiracy theory to which I don't subscribe at all. But last year, Iran licensed the beginning of a petroleum exchange that is denominated in, guess what, euros. And but I just throw those things out just to give you some idea of where. I'll just take one other area, and then I'll give you an idea of how the book came about. And this is the area of the global positioning satellites. Right, we all live with it now. Our cell phones have it. The American GPS is the standard of the world. Roughly $12 billion of business is done using the GPS signals. It's growing at 20% a year, and will for some time. The United States has the monopoly on it. Everyone in the world has to depend on the American satellite. Well, this monopoly is about to end. 3 years from now, the European satellite system called Galileo will be operational. And when that happens, that monopoly ends. Well, what happens to the business that depends on that monopoly? So even though this relationship is huge, and thank God it is huge, it is not a given that it will always remain that way. So let me now talk a little bit about how this book came to be. I used to run a company that set up financial software for international companies. And a lot of clients were in Europe. And in the early 90s, they were concerned about the impact of the euro, as the new currency was going to be called, on their software system. So together with other people, I started to look into this. There were technical issues, right? If you may recall that the Spanish currency then did not have decimal points. So if you went to Spain, the cash registers all worked in whole numbers. Well, the euro has decimal points. So what do you do and how do you change? But I realized very quickly that those technical issues were rather simple to fix, that it was the broad strategic issues that European integration and the euro would bring to the surface that were the heart of what businesses ought to be looking at. As an example, General Electric works throughout Europe. Most companies will try and balance their revenues and expenditures in the same currency when they operate their affiliates in other countries. Well, GE estimated that they would save about $65 million a year when the euro came into being, because they then would only have to raise one currency instead of Deutschmarks and French francs and so on. The same issues in pricing. You may recall that cars cost about 20% more in Southern Europe than they did in Central Europe. And how do you price this? So those were the strategic issues that were starting to surface. And I started to think about that. And from there, well, just as a comparison, when you came back here, the idea was that the euro would never be. The Wall Street Journal didn't run its editorial, the first editorial on the euro, if I remember correctly, about 8 months before the euro was launched. The Foreign Policy Association actually, together with my then company, did one of the earliest conferences on the impact of the euro on American business. I arranged a conference at the State Department roughly 6 months before the euro came into being. A lot of the Clinton cabinet people were there, and a remark made by the keynote speaker was that, to his knowledge, that was the first conference on the impact of the euro that had been held in Washington. So I got to thinking about why that would be so. And one of the conclusions I came to is that it is because in a lot of areas, America looks at Europe through what I call Anglo-tinted glasses. We tend to look at Europe in the way the Brits, and I use that word fondly. I have an enormous admiration for Britain. In fact, my wife thinks I always wish I was born in the Victorian age and so on. But as far as foreign policy is concerned, I came to realize that that is an enormous mistake, that we need to shift, in my opinion, and we can discuss this and talk about this during the Q&A session. I came to the conclusion that it would be far better, healthier for both Britain and America to transform the so-called special relationship with Britain to become a special relationship with the European Union. That the center of gravity had irrevocably shifted over the last 50 years to the European Union, and that's where our focus ought to be. I also maintain that it would have been very difficult to start the Iraqi war if that kind of special relationship had been in place at that point. So that's how I started to think about this. And then the lead up to the Iraqi war, we were at Ditchley, the Foreign Policy Association, a number of us, and when we came back, this was 3 months after the invasion of Iraq. Do you remember how hot tempers were between the Europeans and the Americans? And the Foreign Policy Association had a dinner, their annual dinner, and the two key speakers there were Javier Solana and Colin Powell. Dinner begins. The West Point Band plays the American national anthem. Everyone rises. Finish. Everyone waits for the European Union's national anthem to be played. We wait. We wait. Nothing. We all sit down. But it turns out the Defense Department, State Department, don't recognize that national anthem. So as I understand it, they were given the option of playing a recorded national anthem, which really degrading choice, the Europeans had refused. So to me, that is an indication of the disconnect that this country has shown with the European Union ever since it started coming together 50 years ago. And that's been a big mistake, in my opinion. And again, I ascribe a lot of that to looking at Europe through Anglo-tinted glasses. So being a businessman, you know, when you run into a crossroads where you have to make a bet-your-company decisions, what business titans like to do is gather together a whole number of experts and take them off to a retreat and then try and figure out what to do next. And what I decided to do was see if I could tap into people who'd actually had their hands on the power structure and see if they would talk about these issues which were rattling around in my mind. And the list ultimately was 10 leaders from both sides of the Atlantic, and they included the President's father, they included Secretary Baker, General Scowcroft, Wesley Clark, General Clark, Caspar Weinberger, Mr. Major, the former Prime Minister, Ana Palacio, who used to be the Foreign Minister of Spain, Mr. Hugo Paumann, and so on. And so I spent time with them. I spent an hour or two with each person, and I asked them all these questions that were rattling around in my mind, such as NATO. I was coming to a conclusion that NATO was just dysfunctional and that it ought to be disbanded as a military alliance, that it was causing more friction between the allies than anything else. And then this idea of the Anglo-tinted glasses. I also wanted to talk to them about whether they thought this rift was just like all the other rifts we'd had in the past, whether it would just go away and if we had a change in personalities. So I talked to them and then wrote this book. My original idea was to write it as a collection of conversations with transatlantic leaders. But one of the people I talked to asked me, he said, so what are you going to do after you finish talking with all of us about these issues? And I said, well, I'm going to put them together in a collection of conversations. And he said, God, that's a boring thing to do. He said, no one's going to read that. He said, tell us your story and then add or subtract to it from our conversation. So that's how the book came to be. And I had been thinking about all these issues for 4 years as a businessman and as a person involved with the foreign policy, someone who thinks about foreign policy. And I just wanted to put it down before I forgot all of the conversations I'd had. So the book was roughly 4 years in the making. There is a sad note to this book, which is that even after 4 years, there has been very little change in the relationship in the transatlantic alliance. Let me stop there. That gives you an idea of what some of the main arguments are, how the book came to be, and I'm ready, willing, and able to engage on a Q&A. Yes.
Mr. Kashmeri, I don't know so much about the economical aspects of the relationship. You know it better, of course. But politically, as far as I recall and follow the events, during the Clinton administration, the relationship with Europe politically was truly, I think, respected. America was respected. What America stands for and its value was respected. But it was only during the last 8 years, because of this administration, that America's credibility has been ruined. So wouldn't that be fair to say that the relationship between EU is mostly bad with this administration rather than saying with the U.S., because as far as I'm concerned, this administration does not represent the United States and its values. So wouldn't that be fair to say that it is only because of this administration, not so much because of what U.S. stands for?
Well, I would disagree for the following reason. First, let me tell you where I agree. And that is that, yes, things were a lot politer, perhaps, during the Clinton administration, that there was a lot more hand-holding and reading of poetry across the Atlantic. But I'm not certain that that extended very far down, if you drill down, extended very far into the substance area, for the reason that the European Union had actually, as you know, begun right in the 50s, right after the Second World War, and had been developing and growing and expanding and becoming more of a cohesive entity all of those years. And we just didn't engage as much with them as we had. If you will look back to the Clinton years, for example, there were some very serious spats. They had to do with privacy issues. They had to do with a number of issues that came up. There was a constant series. Genetic foods was another one. There were a constant series of issues that were dealt with. In fact, I remember we did a conference at the American Embassy in London on the European impact of the euro, and it created a huge amount of interest on the part of the British media. Everybody wanted to know, what does this mean? That is America's gaze shifting towards the other side of the Atlantic or not? In fact, the only statement I remember in support of the European single currency during that administration was, well, if it's good for the Europeans, it's good for us. That was kind of some extent of description of an event that I maintain is of historic proportions, that was changing the landscape the European side. So I do agree that the temperatures were cooler, that there was more of a conversation going on, but I think that the disconnect had started much earlier, and there was very little done, even at that time, to connect it. Yes, sir.
Can I ask you about the future implications of that? Because if you look at what's represented by European integration over the last 50 years, which I think a lot of people don't understand, but a lot of people also fail to recognize is really unique in world history. And you look at the values that have been expressed by that: consensus management, soft power, a sense of social solidarity, etc., concern for the general good, and a lot of creaky administrative problems as well, but setting those aside. And then you look at the traditional, and perhaps not just this administration, what is thought of as the traditional American way of approaching problems, which is more nationalistic, more individualistic, more adversarial, more about the management of abundance than the management of scarcity. And then you look at the problems of the 21st century, and you ask yourself, which set of approaches is better suited to the problems of the 21st century? My question is that something you talk about in the book? And if it isn't, is it something you'd be happy to talk about right now?
Well, I do talk about it in the book, and what I do want to do, if it's all right with you, is read you two short passages. One of them actually deals with the beginning of where I wanted this answer to go. But one of the issues I maintain is that we've never really understood in the United States how deep the differences go in how the Europeans think and how we think in America. I'd like to read you a short passage. This is a conversation with Mr. Hugo Palman, who was the ambassador from the European Union to the United States. A very experienced diplomat. We were talking about some of the differences and so on. And I said, what about war? I said, here's a simple word, war. What do you think about? And here's what he says. He says, for the majority of the Americans, war is a kind of heroic event. Courageous young men go to a faraway land to fight what they consider to be the good cause, with all the technology and moral support the nation can muster, and determined to show the rest of the world what they're capable of. They return victorious, they are celebrated, even the families of those who are killed are proud that these men and women sacrificed their lives for the nation. But for most Europeans, war is synonymous with seeing your own city destroyed, and a lot of innocent victims, often your own family, killed. It is not a heroic event at all, he said. The American action represented the threat of a war and all of its horrors without a clearly defined target. He was talking about Iraq. And then he goes on and talks about Osama bin Laden, to Al-Qaeda, to Iraq, and possibly, and so on. But he was trying to again explain what how deep and profound these differences are. And then it was Ana Palacio, the former foreign minister of Spain, who actually gave me the ideas that I very pompously put in the book as my suggestions on how to move ahead and create a better alliance. And this is what she said. She said, Robert Schuman, the visionary founder of the European Union, conceived what in hindsight was a fail-safe technique for the integration of Europe. She said that Mr. Schuman realized that there were so many differences over so many centuries that you couldn't just say, let's build a new Europe and move on with it. And she said, what we needed to do, she said, what Schuman realized we needed to do, she calls la solidarité des faits. She said, tangible projects that create tangible solidarity was his way forward. The European approach is all about overcoming divides. Indeed, Europe is based on the biggest of all divides, centuries of bloody wars between Europeans, she told me. The European way is to acknowledge the divide, but put it aside, and then create common ground on which to build specific projects. Then you revisit the rift, assess it, and overcome it. And I thought that was an eminently suitable way for Europe and America to proceed, because rather than saying, hey, let's fix it all, as the Europeans say, an ever closer union, we ought to be saying an ever closer transatlantic alliance. And so the first thing that I propose is that we engage with the Europeans and set up new rules of when force will be used and under what circumstances and what are the values that need to be defended. And then I suggest we take a series of projects having to do with the issues that face us and will face us over the next decades, poverty, illiteracy, disease, inequality, all of education, all of those issues, and join together to take those projects and move with them. This will be a long-term engagement. The United States, my position, has lost an enormous amount of credibility. A lot of what this has to take place is in the Islamic lands. We've fast lost credibility in the Middle East, and in my opinion, unless we're careful, we're about to lose it in the entire Muslim world, which is 1 billion people running throughout the globe. So that having gone there, the Europeans still have that credibility, but America still have the resources, and my thought is why not put the two together and start a series of projects which engage both sides over the long term, which was Robert Schumann's idea of creating the European Union, an ever closer union. He knew you'd probably get there at some point, but you couldn't start there. I don't know whether that starts addressing your question, but that's where I wanted to go. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I was going to ask, you talked about policy differences and political differences, but it seems to me, aren't there, first Europe doesn't speak with one voice, not the United States, but with Europe you have the Eastern Orthodox, for instance, and the Catholic parts have been in conflict with each other with Kosovo and things like that. And I'm wondering, though, in general, apart from that, cultural roots bind us much stronger, or even after a century of fascism, communism, and so on. The Germans have a soft spot for the Croats, the Russians for the Serbs, and so on. And and in fact, all these countries are brought up on. I think we all went to school and read about Hellenistic and Roman civilizations.
Right.
We read the same books.
Right. It's I take that argument, and here's how I attack it. I mean, the issue is that Europe is a collection of very old states. But the point I make is that I was born in Bombay, and the point I make is if you were to go from the north of India to the south of India, you would find as many races, as many cultures, as many languages, perhaps even more, than going from Scandinavia to Spain. There is no reason for that entity to have become a country, and the reason it has, very frankly, in my opinion, was because of the 300-year-old relationship with England, with all of the values that then came to the fore. And that's how the idea of a nation began. And so that's a very recent one. I mean, most people think India has been a country for centuries, but it's not. It became a country in 1947, and it started becoming a country maybe 30 years before that. So I don't believe that Europe will not ultimately become some kind of a political union. And then I might also remind you that over 50 years, the European states, sovereign states, have been giving more and more powers to the European Union. Right, 80% of business law is now made in Brussels. More and more, when American negotiators sit across the table, they have one voice that comes out from the other side. Yeah, think about the data exchange for the airline, the terrorism laws. Think about genetic foods. Think about trade. Think about all of these other issues. The Galileo satellite system. The Pentagon immediately said, "Hey, you can't be setting that up because we have one, and you set that up, and signals will collide." Well, they were dealing with one representative who was handling that. The Foreign Policy Association invited Mr. Mario Monti, then the Mergers and Acquisition czar, over for a lunch. And I still remember that there were special invitations issued to General Electric to come join us for lunch. We didn't see anyone from there. They were obviously busy. But do you remember that General Electric was proposing to buy Honeywell, two American companies, right? And all the American authorities had passed on that and said, it's great. Well, the Europeans said, sorry, no. but there was one czar. So increasingly, Europe speaks with one voice. Mary.
It seems to me that for instance, the Europeans, even though they want to be a major part in all, when there's a problem, they look to us. I was thinking of the Balkans. They didn't make much of an effort to do anything about that war. They expected us to do something. So, in a way, they create some of the problem of the divide between us because they seem to think we should be the ones to do the fighting and have the army, and they'll have their peace and their labor unions and womb-to-tomb care and all. And so I think you've got to get a connection between what they can have and what we can have closer together.
Absolutely. The rules of engagement, as I call them. And I couldn't agree. I mean, I do agree with you. I remember the BBC in an interview asked me, do you remember that ridiculous face about Europeans are from Mars and Americans are from Venus that someone cooked up? And the BBC asked me what I thought about that. And I said, I profoundly disagree with it. And they said, why? And I said, well, because as far as I'm concerned, both sides are living on Pluto and they need to come back to Earth. So I do agree. But, let me remind you that when they feel threatened, that when they are properly engaged, Europeans are probably more capable of fighting than any group on Earth. I mean, they've perfected it over the centuries, right? Mr. Major told me, he said, think back 500 years, he said, you won't find a single year in which Britain has not fought a war. He said, we're used to this kind of stuff. It doesn't bother us that much. I mean, I'm paraphrasing here, and he didn't mean it that cavalierly. And in Afghanistan, right, who is with the American Special Forces looking for Osama bin Laden? It's the French Special Forces. So yes, I do agree. But again, I go back that we should have engaged with them 40 years ago. All of this should have come up systematically to where it would have created a whole new frame that we could now use. But that's not happened.
You talked about trying to heal the drift with kind of some of the smaller projects.
Right.
And I guess, how do you start doing that in a static environment where everything that's going on in the world isn't going on? That seems like maybe it's easier to do, but when we're where we are right now, where the drift is already widened because of the wars and terror, our respective efforts in the fight against terrorism and whatnot, how do you start to heal that drift?
Well, it's going to be very difficult, as you so rightly point out. When I talked with Mr. Baker, to me, the senior Mr. Bush and Baker and Scowcroft represented some of the finest security team that this country's seen. So I said, hey, if you guys were in power right now, I said, wouldn't you call Mr. Chirac and say, hey, look, we're coming over for breakfast. Make a good omelet and let's talk about this. And he said, no. He said, things have just become far too personal at this point. So yes, I do agree. But we are the superpower. The United States is a superpower. And as a businessman, I think in very simple terms. I see nothing wrong with rolling in and saying, hey, things aren't going that well. I think we messed up a bit, but you guys did too, but maybe we messed up a little more. Let's sit down and work this out. We need to plan the next 50 years. That's how I think, and that's what I propose in the book.
What kind of a role do you envisage for the United Nations in all of this?
Enormous. In fact, one of the big differences that I found throughout my conversations and in conversations with just lay Europeans is that Europeans think in terms of a United Nations-centric world, not an American-centric world. And this is a huge difference. And I believe that the United Nations ought to be strengthened. I put that in the book. And I think that is one of the projects that needs to be worked on, is how do we strengthen the United Nations. The other project that I propose is once the two sides get together to talk about the rules of engagement, when will force be used and not used, that we disband the military side of NATO. To me, it creates a lot of issues because for those of you, and I'm sure all of you have read the charter of NATO, it mentions in the very first paragraph that NATO will be subservient to the Security Council. I'm paraphrasing now, but it says that it is the Security Council whose responsibility it is to maintain peace in the world, and that NATO is, new organization. Well, think about this. So if that is really true, NATO really cannot be used unless there's consensus between the European Union, the United States, and the United Nations, right? And so how does that come about with this rift? I further maintain that that with all of this, all of these issues with the Islamic world, that if we try to strengthen the United Nations, it will be one more example to the Muslims that this is, well, another Western way to encircle us. And then finally, it's an American-led operation. And I don't believe the Europeans are going to let it be an American-run operation and for it to continue to be what it is now. It's interesting, when the NATO agreement was being signed in Washington after many years of negotiation, everyone was in a happy mood. And the Marine band was playing at the ceremony. And Cole Porter was very popular then, and they started off, and their first song was, "It Ain't Necessarily So." Yes. The lady, please. Sorry, you're next.
Could you talk about how competition over capital markets may affect U.S.-EU relations in the future, and how that is impacting
I'm not competent to get into the details of that. And all I will tell you is what one picks up from the scuttlebutt on Wall Street is that we just need to be very careful about regulations. We need to be careful about what we're doing going forward, because otherwise the power is shifting to London. Whether that is true, I don't know. A case in point on this is the series of conversations that are now going on the so-called Islamic bond. I have to be very careful and make sure I pronounce the bond rightly, the Islamic bond. And these are bonds that follow the Islamic law, Sharia, where London is starting to take a leadership role because of the enormous amounts of money that are sitting out there in the Middle East. So besides those general areas, I am not competent to answer that. I apologize.
To some of the capital in the Middle East, as well as mentioned and immediate conflict in the United States' credibility in the world, and that's an ongoing issue. I mean, what's going to happen as more and more of the Muslim world inhabits the EU? I mean, if Turkey, that's a whole group that can move up, and as more and more money and more open kind of borders, in a sense that the community can kind of just become a Muslim EU in a sense over 50 or 100 years. That's a new rift. I mean, is that you think that's a possibility? That's happening?
Well, I don't know. They're saying 50 years we are going to become a Hispanic country, right? So is there a big rift between Spanish and Muslims? I don't know.
I like very much your story about the two anthems. Now let me suggest something else. A conference where you have the European saying something about planet Earth, about global warming, about the need to have carbon trades, about need to have a cap of emissions of renewable energy, and then the US is supposed to say something, and what we hear is, this is going to harm our economy. We don't play this anthem. Now, my question to you is very serious. After everything else that you've said, looking to the future, how is going to be possible to bring together the two sides of the ocean?
Well, as I say, I've proposed a few ways in which I think it might be possible. But I was at an event earlier, late last week, and the question from the audience was, well, if things keep going this way, maybe that's the natural evolution of this relationship. That maybe we'll be left with the business relationship, but the other relationship will just go because the world moves on. But I don't believe that. I think the transatlantic relationship is enormously important for all of the reasons I've previously outlined. And I think it behooves America, behooves us, to be proactive in sitting down with the other side and laying out a new half century of working together. I mean, you think back to the leadership. You know, United States has traditionally been a leader. We just have that in our DNA. But those leadership's been exercised with other countries. It has been exercised with other people, with consensus. That's what's changed. Senator Hagel pointed out, he said 40% of the world today doesn't know what Vietnam was. Forget about all the goodwill that America generated after the Second World War. They're basing their judgment on what they've seen in the last few years. So if that is the case, then we need to work on it, and I think we need to work on it together with the Europeans. The business world is rapidly shifting to China and India because 50 years from now, those are the two economies. And if you look at China, right, things are not as peaceful there. The curve may not be as smooth going forward. You look at India, right, 1 billion people, 200 million middle class. Well, what about the other 800 million? But this is the pool around the world from which extremists and terrorists, if they want to, get their recruits. So I think it's up to the Europeans and Americans pull together to create a new world.
Yeah, but my question wasn't that. My question was about the physical environment that they worry about, but we destroy. So it's not working together, it's them working for planet Earth, and we work how to destroy it. Now, how do you bridge that? Because I'm participating in meetings that have to do with environmental issues.
Yeah,
I listened 2 days ago to the head of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change speaking at the UN. He simply sees here a different planet. I mean, the anthem isn't played. The anthem of planet Earth
isn't played. Maybe we'll get the answer tonight at the State of the Union. I understand there's going to be more on global warming and so on, but perhaps we can continue it on outside. I'm here as long as you want me to be. A couple more we can take. Yes, sir.
The EU project started sort of 60 years ago in the minds of a few people, and as you say, it was sort of an incremental approach. Pick what works and then build on it, and over time.
Yes.
What do you see is it possible that there could be a similar vision for the future of the transatlantic relationship? I mean, go beyond this idea of just small projects as a roadmap, but is it worth setting out a sort of 60-year customs union economic area, like something transformative about this area that could be used as a roadmap to follow?
That's a really good question, and I think that the recent proposal made by Angela Merkel from Germany about a free trade zone between the European Union and the United States has much to say for it. Now, there is an engagement that will keep everyone productively busy over a long haul. And then there are the others, the security issues and so on. And I do maintain that coming to an understanding of when force will be used, how will it be used, whether the United Nations will be at the center of it, well, is the place to start. Bill.
You say that the opportunity for achievement of your objective is to be focused on tangible goals, projects which have definable objectives and allocation of resources. Haven't the Europeans given a good demonstration of leadership in respect of how they're proposing to deal with Iran's nuclear ambitions? We've been reluctantly dragged into it, but that would seem to be a focal point where there would be common interest. And in response to this other gentleman's comment, I think we have to humble the hegemon in order to open minds and recognize that we don't have the whole answer from the beginning.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, that's actually what I say in my book, is that it sounds really weird, but maybe hat in the hand is not that bad all the time. Realizing fully that superpowers don't do that, maybe we should. What do we lose?
Pretty dark days, and you were speaking to some very esteemed gentlemen who know
I had nothing to do with it.
The comment is you mentioned engagement on the transatlantic side with these great problems that we face, pandemics, poverty, etc. You're basically paraphrasing the Millennium Development Goals from the UN. And I would say that while transatlantic engagement is a necessary condition on all these fronts, it's not sufficient. And that when you look at the Doha round, when you look at engaging in the United Nations, it's no longer a two-entity game, it's a multilateral game.
Yes, and I accept all of those. And hopefully the engagement within the UN on a much wider lens, through a much wider lens, will follow. I mean, I'm a strong believer in the UN, always have been, and I think it ought to be strengthened. Christopher Matthews with the European Commission was one of the people who I used to lean on in those days in the early 90s when information on the euro was almost absent on this side of the Atlantic. In fact, the BBC, when we did the conference with the Foreign Policy Association, I remember went to this nattily dressed gentleman on the street. This is mid-90s, and said, "What do you think of the euro?" And the guy said, "I like that idea of the new airline," he said. Let's take two more and then we'll close down, if there are any. And I'm here for as long as you like to talk.
Two of the powerhouse countries in the European Union are sort of experiencing some leadership change. Well, Angela Merkel has been in Germany for a while. She's rather pro-American, as you know. And in France, we have elections coming up in April. Nicolas Sarkozy wins, another pro-American leader might emerge there. I wonder, talking about the future of U.S. relations, how that might impact the relationship.
Hard to tell. I really could not go there. I mean, the only given is that the Europeans have decided that they're going to have a European Union, and it's going to become a deeper and broader and continue to grow. I mean, that we know. We also know, and if we accept that the United States and the Europeans need to work together, then we ought to take steps to remedy that. People will come and people will go, but these institutions that have been established seem like they're going to go on forever. There's a poem to that effect somewhere. Yes, ma'am.
Assuming that Great Britain decides to adopt the euro, which I've heard is becoming more likely because of, it makes it easier to get down and if they want to continue to grow in capital markets. What will that do to the United States? Because I would assume then that that Great Britain would become much more tied in, and there would be more of a separation with the United States.
Well, I don't know how to head in that direction. What I will tell you is that the euro, which a lot of people poo-pooed, is on the upswing. Right? There are more euro banknotes today than there are dollar notes. More bonds, more debt was generated in euros last year than generated in dollars. I'm still on the fence as far as Britain adopting the euro. My concern really is, it's for Britain as a sovereign country to decide what it wants to do. My concern really is that the American foreign policy lens not look at Europe through what I call Anglo-tinted glasses. Now, I might remind you, when the European Union started the coal and steel community, the reason then given by Britain was, we couldn't possibly join that free market enterprise because Britain then was running along a socialist track. Well, the reason now is that, the Anglo-Saxon way of doing things is completely different. But be that as it may, this is a country with whom we will continue to have huge ties. There are military ties, intelligence ties, business ties, cultural ties, go very deep and very long. The narrow issue that I'm looking at, and I want to close with this quote from Dean Acheson, who to me was one of the great American secretaries of state who really wanted Britain to join the coal and steel community. And in his book called President at the Creation, which if you've not read, I would recommend to you, he says, despite my earnest arguments, In the next few days, Britain made her great mistake of the post-war period by refusing to join in negotiating the Schuman Plan. From the bitter fruits of this mistake, both Britain and Europe are still suffering. So my thought is that doing that will help Britain, will help Europe, and certainly will help American foreign policy. I want to thank the Foreign Policy Association again for giving me this opportunity. I want to thank you, Jim, for that scintillating introduction. And I really want to thank all of you for taking the time to come here. It means a lot to me. Thank you very much.